Hello there, this is John Swin. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. This video will be covering information regarding Paul E. Vallely and his role in PsyOps, Delta Force, his role at Fox News, the Iraq War, the Tea Party and alternative media. Paul E. Vallely, born November the 29th, 1939, is a retired US Army Major General and senior military analyst for Fox News. He served in the Vietnam War and retired in 1993 as Deputy Commanding General, Pacific Command. In 2004, together with retired Air Force Lieutenant General Thomas McInerney, Vallely co-authored the book Endgame, The Blueprint for Victory in the War on Terror. So an interesting note to begin with is, in 2007, Alex Jones released a documentary film called Endgame, Blueprint for Global Enslavement. As far as the General Vallely co-authored book goes, I guess we should listen to the guy who helped lobby the public into supporting the Iraq War, with the narrative of being an effort to combat terrorism, on how to end the quote-unquote war on terror. General Vallely serves as the military committee chairman for Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy. The Center for Security Policy is financed by major military-industrial complex corporations such as General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing and Raytheon, as well as big foundations such as the Sarah Scaife Foundation, the Bradley Foundation and Templeton Foundation, as well as Zionist billionaires such as Nina Rosenwald. Frank Gaffney and his associates and extended groups such as the Committee on the Present Danger China, Islamophobia Network that include the likes of Daniel Pipes, David Horowitz, Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller, serve the interests of their financiers. General Vallely is no different in that respect. Working for the Center for Security Policy, Vallely would occasionally write articles and give lectures on the war on terror. Some of his public statements have caused controversy, such as proclaiming that we are not going to permit a Shiite victory in an Iraqi election, and claiming that the war on terror is a war between Islam and Judeo-Christianity. That's what's going on. If you don't understand that, then you don't get it, said General Vallely. Vallely's religious war ideology is one similar to Eric Prince's religious crusade rhetoric held by many of his close associates during his time operating the private military group Blackwater, who received government contracts to operate in Iraq.
The slaughter of civilians for sport, weapons smuggling, destruction of evidence, wholesale corruption, and finally murder. In our third story in the countdown, a full-fledged criminal enterprise executed by the military contractors known formerly as Blackwater, according to the sworn testimony of two of its employees. The nation's Jeremy Scahill, who broke the story, joins us in a moment. The details come straight from two sworn affidavits filed late last night by persons whose identities have been sealed to protect their identity, men who have previously cooperated with federal prosecutors in the criminal inquiry into Blackwater. From John Doe number 2, a former member of Blackwater's management team, quoting the affidavit, it appears that Mr. Eric Prince, Blackwater's founder, and his employees murdered or had murdered one or more persons who have provided information or who were planning to provide information to the federal authorities about the ongoing criminal conduct. On several occasions after my departure from Mr. Prince's employ, Mr. Prince's management has personally threatened me with death and violence. John Doe number 2 also stating that Mr. Prince, pictured here, smuggled unlawful weapons into Iraq Iraq, including sawed-off semi-automatic machine guns with silencers and illegal hand grenades. And the affidavit also says that Prince, quote, views himself as a Christian crusader eliminating Muslims and the Islamic faith from the globe. To that end, Mr. Prince intentionally deployed to Iraq certain men who shared his vision of Christian supremacy. Many of these men used call signs based on the Knights of the Templar, the warriors who fought the Crusades. Mr. Prince operated his companies in a manner that encouraged and rewarded the destruction of Iraqi life. Going to Iraq to shoot and kill Iraqis was viewed as a sport or game. Strikingly similar allegations made in the affidavit of John Doe No. 1, a former U.S. Marine who worked for Blackwater in Iraq. He alleges that incidents of unjustified deadly force were initially videotaped and watched in a session called a hot wash. Blackwater, now known as Z Services, spelled XE, maintains that Mr. Prince and the company are innocent of any wrongdoing and performed their duties on behalf of their employer, the State Department. Joining me now, as promised, the contributor to The Nation magazine and author of Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, Jeremy Scahill. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me back, Keith.
As horrific as all this sounds, it's just part of what you described in the piece today. Flesh it out for us.
Well, I mean, obviously, to hear the term murder and Blackwater in the same sentence is no great surprise, particularly to people who've been following the history of this company. It's been at the center of some of the worst violence in Iraq, killing civilians repeatedly. 5 of its men are going to be tried on manslaughter charges for the Nicer Square massacre in Baghdad in September of '07. Another one pled guilty. The Congress is investigating. The IRS is investigating. This is a scandal-plagued company. What is explosive about what's happened here, and you just went through some of the most explosive of these details, is that you have 2 former Blackwater officials. I have learned from sources that John Doe No. 2 was actually in Blackwater management and was privy to some of the inner workings of the company. Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, remains the sole owner of the company no matter that he stepped down as CEO and the founder of the company. He micromanages every aspect of Blackwater's operations, and that's been well known. On the Christian supremacist angle, let's remember that Eric Prince viewed Blackwater as a neo-crusader force and has from the beginning. This is a guy who comes from one of the powerhouse families of the radical religious right. His father was a major bankroller and gave the seed money to Gary Bauer to start the Family Research Council. James Dobson focused on the family. And then we have his forces deployed in Iraq as part of a war against a Muslim nation that George Bush characterized as a crusade. What we have here, Keith, is a confirmation from insiders at Blackwater that, in fact, Eric Prince did have a neo-crusader agenda and, most explosively, may have murdered or facilitated the murder of individuals that were intending to or did cooperate in the federal government's criminal investigation of Blackwater. This is deadly serious.
All right, to the murder in a second, but you mentioned something in here that strikes an obvious question. How could the Bush administration, the State Department, have missed this crusader element here, or was that what they were looking for?
Missed it? I think it was considered a plus in the Bush White House. Remember, Keith, what we had here was the Bush administration essentially create a force that acted as an armed wing of the administration, not subject to the military command, not subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, that reported directly to George Bush's Secretary of State and then to the President. These were his men, his private force in Baghdad, and the allegations that they were running around shooting Iraqis as part of a war to eliminate Islam globally, as is actually what one of these individuals said, is extremely disturbing to anyone who believes in any semblance of Constitution, law, or human rights.
Some specifics, what you know about this is a strong term, murder, in court documents. This is under oath. This is not somebody throwing something up against a wall to see if it'll stick. Are we talking about something related to the 2007 Baghdad massacre, or something here? It's
unclear, but this is what I'll tell you what I do know about this, Keith. The fact of the matter is that these individuals in these sworn depositions provided those depositions to lawyers, Susan Burke and the Center for Constitutional Rights, that are suing Blackwater on behalf of Iraqis killed by Blackwater operatives in Iraq. They're suing them in civil litigation. What we do know is that these same individuals say that they gave this identical information to the federal government, one of them in grand jury testimony, as part of the ongoing criminal investigation. When I called the Justice Department and asked specifically, are you investigating Eric Prince on allegations that he was involved with murder, the Justice Department interestingly said that they would not confirm or deny any actions that they may or may not be taking against uncharged individuals. Eric Prince, according to the lawyers suing Blackwater, could be eligible for murder charges in both Virginia and the state of North Carolina under existing law. That's the argument they're making in their motion that was filed late last night in the Eastern District of Virginia.
Jeremy Scahill, who has been the watchdog on Blackwater, now Z of the Nation, who brought this story to everyone's attention today. Great thanks for doing so. And great.
Major General Vallely's Judeo-Christian beliefs also have been expressed in his support of the Jerusalem Summit organization that advocate the resettling of all Palestinian people to other surrounding Arab nations as a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and to bring about the organization's belief that one of the objectives of Israel's divinely inspired rebirth is to make it the center of a new unity of the nations, which will lead to a new era of peace and prosperity. It doesn't end there. Vallely has been a consistent promoter of fear-mongering in regards to Islam. In a letter of support of the Veteran Defenders of America, he stated, "Perhaps the greatest threat to our safety and liberty is the threat of radical Islam. This threat goes well beyond the threat of terrorism. Islamists, both inside and outside of America, are looking for any and every way to infiltrate and subvert our country through what is known as stealth jihad." Vallely and his extended anti-Islam network surrounding Frank Gaffney have promoted all kinds of anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, such as claiming former CIA director John Brennan as being a secret Muslim, Hillary Clinton aide Umar Abedin as being part of a Muslim Brotherhood plot to infiltrate the United States, as well as the birther conspiracy claiming the 44th US President Barack Obama was not a natural-born citizen, therefore making him an illegitimate president. This issue of the birth certificate is what catapulted Donald Trump onto the political landscape. Looking into the background of Major General Vallely, the underlying philosophy of Trumpism, and certain statements from high-level political operatives, we can see a clear pattern of what can be described as a war on reality, or creation of a alt reality.
John Brennan was the CIA station chief in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. This is not prominently talked about on any of the mainstream media outlets. He stamped the 9/11 hijackers' passports and allowed their paperwork to get through without even being, properly filled out. This is the same John Brennan we're having to contend with now. John Brennan, okay, we have still not held him accountable for that mistake in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and allowing those terrorists to fly into the World Trade Center towers and attacking our nation and changing the world forever. You're well aware of this, correct?
Correct. And he converted to Islam while he was in Saudi Arabia.
Yes, sir. We definitely want to highlight that.
Valerie Plame. Prior to the Iraq invasion, George W. Bush's White House falsely quoted CIA analysts as believing that Iraq was trying to acquire nuclear weapons and that aluminium tubes. Plame's work concerned the determination of the use of aluminium tubes purchased by Iraq could be used in a centrifuge for nuclear enrichment. David Cohen and Michael Isikoff argued that the undercover work being done by Plame and her CIA colleagues in the Directorate of Central Intelligence Non-Proliferation Center strongly contradicted such a claim. After Plame's conclusions didn't fit into the narrative that George W. Bush White House and Wall Street Network in the Pentagon wished to push to deceptively provide justification for an invasion of Iraq, she was publicly outed as a CIA asset as punishment. On July 14, 2003, Robert Novak, a journalist for the Washington Post, used information obtained from Richard Armitage, Karl Rove, and Scooter Libby to reveal Plame's identity as a CIA operative in his column. This affair further undermined civilian intelligence. In response to Plamegate, Vallely made public statements defending Novak and claimed it was known that Plame was a CIA asset, arguing that she wasn't working covertly. Vallely made contradictory statements regarding when and how many times Wilson, Plame's husband, supposedly mentioned Plame's employment. Vallely initially claimed that Wilson revealed his wife's CIA employment over the course of at least 3 conversations beginning in spring 2002. But Vallely changed his story days later, saying that Wilson told him about Plame's work only once in the summer or fall of that year. In response to Vallely's claims, Wilson said, "This is slanderous." Wilson wrote, "I never appeared on TV before at least July 2002 and only saw him," referring to Vallely, "maybe twice in the green room at Fox. Vallely is a retired general and this is a bold-faced lie. Can we sue? This is not he said she said, since I never laid eyes on him till several months after he alleges I spoke to him about my wife." Prior to July 14th, 2003, Valerie Wilson's employment status was classified. Prior to that date, her affiliation with the CIA was not common knowledge outside the intelligence community. Knowing that this fact was a pivotal one in proving the case against Scooter Libby, a logical conclusion would be that Vallely was trying to establish a narrative that it was known outside intelligence that Plame worked for the CIA, and her husband was a source of this knowledge as an attempt to undermine the charges against Scooter Libby. Libby was assistant to the Vice President for National Security Affairs, Chief of Staff to the Vice President of the United States, and assistant to the President during the administration of President George W. Bush. Libby was convicted of 4 counts, 1 count of obstruction of justice, 2 counts of perjury, and 1 count of making false statements, making him the highest-ranking White House official convicted in a government scandal since John Poindexter, the National Security Advisor to President Reagan in the Iran-Contra affair. According to statements made by Vallely, a week following the events of 9/11, he was recruited as a senior military analyst at Fox News.
But those that are listening to us are all of a sudden going to start calling us Islamophobic. I say I'm not against Islam per se. I'm against global Islamic terrorist, which I consider that he was assisting that in many ways, especially by letting those hijackers in. So 9/11 was never really fully properly investigated. We never held people accountable for the mistakes that were made. You had whistleblowers in the FBI that were saying, "Oh my goodness, you've seen all the signs, all the intel reports. This stuff was covered up. For what purposes do you believe? Was it for profits of war?"
There were a lot of conspiracy theories. We have the same thing going on today, and we sort of have to stay away from any of the conspiratorial things.
Yes, sir.
Until we can establish those, as facts. And, talking about John Brennan, he's got to be one of the first one. Durham and Barr have to indict.
Yes.
Along with about 6 others real quick. That's what I would do if I was Barr. Comey, Brennan, Clapper, and it all tracks back to the Obama White House, too, by the way, just like Benghazi did. The week after 9/11, Fox News hired me to be their senior military analyst, and I formed the military analyst team at Fox News up until 2008. And then I've been in the intelligence business for a long, long time. My last 20 years in the Army was in special operations.
In April 2008, documents obtained by New York Times reporter David Barstow revealed that Vallely had been recruited as one of over 75 retired military officers involved in the Pentagon Military Analyst Program. Participants appeared on television and radio news shows as military analysts and/or penned newspaper op-ed columns. The program was launched in early 2002 by then Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, Victoria Clark. The idea was to recruit key influentials to help sell a wary public on a possible Iraq invasion. Under the umbrella of the program, Vallely asked the Pentagon for input on an April 2006 Wall Street Journal editorial defending then Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. As he began work on the op-ed, Vallely emailed, "Any input for the article will be appreciated," to Dallas B. Lawrence, the Defense Department's Director of Community Relations and Public Liaison.
To talk more about it, we welcome in retired United States Army General Paul Vallely. He joins us from Newsmax, New York. He's also the chairman of Stand Up America. Paul, it's great to have you here.
Ask you something else that the president brought up during that interview with Jon Stewart is he kept saying that no one is offering an alternative to the deal that he has presented. What's your reaction to that?
Well, there's been several alternatives. The first of all is no deal. That's a solution that we all believe in, as Bibi Netanyahu does in Israel, who is the prime target over there, with the United States being the next big target.
And speaking of grave concerns, Paul, you have said in the past, you have written articles saying it is your belief that Iran already possesses a nuclear weapon. That is ominous indeed. What leads you to believe that, Paul?
Well, over the past year, J.D., my intel analysts have taken all the evidence, hard evidence, facts, intel reports coming from inside Iran and from the Middle East, and they have, for the past decades, have gotten the support from Russia, from North Korea, and from China. So it's a cabal that's been set up to support the Iranian nuclear program. They have the launch systems, they have the guidance control system, they have the detonation system, they have the warhead. And guess what? Russia and North Korea has tested everything for them. All they have to do is put it together, JD, like a tinker toy, and that's why they have the nuclear capability now, and this agreement is really a moot point. The only reason Iran wants to do it, to get released some $150 billion from sanction money they can take to use to further their programs.
General Valley, I have a question for you from our chat room on the American Rock Radio fan page. Do you know who the individual calling himself or themselves, if it's an organizational effort, Q? What do you know about that? Was that part of the PsyOp? What are you at liberty to say? Or is it a bunch of bunk?
Well, let me just tell you that QAnon's tied to information. And it comes out of a group called the Army of Northern Virginia. Okay?
Yep.
Now, this is a group of military intelligence specialists of over 800 people that advise the president.
And so,
the president doesn't have a lot of confidence in the CIA or even the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, as much anymore. So he relies on these real operators. Most of them are special operations type of people.
Yep.
And so this is where Q picks up and gets some of their information, as I understand it.
you know the name Michael Murphy?
I don't.
Well, Michael Murphy is kind of an old hippie, you might say, out here, but he was the founder of the Esalen Institute down below Big Sur, which is a kind of a place where you go to open up your mind and your brain and schmooze with other people. And he also founded a think tank up in the Bay Area called the Transformation Project with a gentleman named Steve Donovan. So in the 80s, when I was working very intensely in these areas of what you might call the brain architecture and thought architecture and how it works, sooner or later, I ran into Steve Donovan. Actually, the way I did that was that Michael Murphy wrote a book called An End to Ordinary History, which was a very thinly veiled fiction story about psychic experimentation in the Soviet Union. I picked it up in a Berkeley bookstore at some point. I read this book and I said, you know what? This sounds a hell of a lot, that he knows a lot more that he's talking about here than just writing a story. So I got a hold of Michael Murphy and I said, I think your book is not a story. I think it's thinly veiled nonfiction. He said, well, you're right. And he said, if you want to talk about it, he says, you want to talk to Steve Donovan. So Steve Donovan had a nice little apartment down here in the Marina in San Francisco. And his apartment was jammed with file cabinets in which psychic research and mental research from all over the world was in there. I mean, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency had nothing like this. Nothing. So I was like a kid in a candy store. I went in there and I said, Steve, can I just rummage? And he said, be my guest. He was very affable about the whole thing. So a lot of the information, that I used to develop in Mind War began with documentation and things that I first came into when I was looking through the files of the Transformation Project. And
that's an incredible story.
Yeah, well, this happened because both Steve Donovan and Michael Murphy spent a lot of time in the 60s and 70s in the Soviet Union talking with the people back there who were at the very forefront of this kind of experimentation. And the United States, of course, this is a Cold War, so we didn't have our people, our agents or our attachés or anything doing this. They wouldn't have gotten a welcome. But the people like Steve Donovan and Michael Murphy would go over there on their vacation time and talk with these people and get together and have vodka with them and so on and learn all kinds of stuff and then bring it back.
I got to ask you, General, this is another question that I talked about with another fellow that I was talking with just the other day. Do you personally know or have you had interactions with General Michael Flynn?
Yes.
You guys know each other pretty well?
Fairly well.
And have you spoken?
In fact, before I was in Moscow a couple months before he went over, so I talked to him before he left. And then when he left to go over there and go to the 10th banquet of RT, Russian television, and he sat with Putin. I had been in Moscow 2 months earlier than that, setting up the meeting between Trump and Putin, which I did while I was there. And that was at the G20 conference in 2017. So, yes, and Michael Flynn must be vindicated. He was one of the individuals that the deep state attacked first, as you remember. And what they've done to that gentleman who's a great patriot and a soldier have just harmed him and his family so much. So I think all of that's going to be turned around for General Flynn. We'll see what happens shortly.